Coming up this week on A Week in France, France marks 10 years since the first of a wave of terror attacks throughout 2015. Former President Nicolas Sarkozy stands trial on corruption charges and mixed reactions to the death of far-right party founder Jean-Marie Le Pen. Well, Paul Smith joins us on the program today. He is Associate Professor and Head of French and Francophone Studies at the University of Nottingham. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Well, first up this week, then, with a spate of terror attacks that claimed 150 innocent lives in total, 2015 was a devastating year for France. Now, this week, the country marked 10 years since the first wave of those traumatizing events, starting with the assault on the satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo. President Emmanuel Macron and Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, led commemorations by laying wreaths at the weekly's former offices in memory of the 12 who were killed there. That of course, included 8 members of the editorial staff and a police officer. Well, government officials later in the week also attended ceremonies paying tribute to a police officer killed in a suburb south of Paris by the very same assailant who would go on a day later an anti-Semitic rampage at a kosher supermarket in southern Paris, which left 4 dead. Well, he's already the first former president of the Fifth Republic to be definitively sentenced to prison for breaking the law on corruption and influence peddling charges, though he hasn't spent a day in jail. But that's not the last of Nicolas Sarkozy's legal troubles. This week, the former president began standing trial for accusations that he accepted illegal campaign financing from the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, and this in exchange for helping him rehabilitate his international image. Well, Sarkozy has denied any wrongdoing, insisting he never accepted a single Libyan cent, in his words, for his campaign. Here is his lawyer.
He has 4 months to explain himself, to demonstrate his innocence in this case, and to convince the court to focus on analysing the facts and not to conform to this, once again, nebulous theory that has poisoned the investigation for 10 years.
Well, we'll bring on Professor Paul Smith now. Paul, what do you expect to see in this trial?
Quite a lot of fireworks. We already saw Sarkozy defending himself on Thursday, the first opportunity he had to speak in the trial. As your presentation suggested, it's another 4 months to go in this trial, up until early April. So I expect to see Sarkozy and his co-defendants be pretty forthright in their defense of themselves. The others were a little bit more measured in their responses, but certainly Sarkozy will use this as an opportunity to paint himself as being, on this occasion at least, the victim of a very bitter campaign to undermine him.
What strikes you most about this case, Paul? I mean, the facts are really very alarming. I think a lot of them really kind of resemble behavior that one would see from the mafia.
Well, that's part of the problem. I mean, the funding laws, the party funding laws in France are very strict, and of course the problem for Sarkozy is sort of guilt by association. His 2012 campaign expenses weren't ratified. In France, your campaign expenses in presidential elections had to be ratified by the Constitutional Council, and the 2012 campaign finances weren't ratified. And so there's kind of this suggestion of some rather oblique, not to say illegal, carryings on. And this is kind of sort of spooling back towards 2007, which is the campaign that this is relating to. But also, of course, the relationship between Sarkozy, even before he was president, as your report pointed out, the kind of beginning to try to normalize the relationship between Libya and Western states, France taking the lead on that. And then, of course, as soon as that situation shifted during the Sarkozy presidency, this is part of Sarkozy's claim, part of his defense, is that then, once the Western powers decided to intervene in Libya, then that's when the whole thing flips the other way. So it's kind of a number of things sort of coalescing, coinciding, the claims made by the Libyans that Sarkozy accepted that funding, but also a kind of residual suspicion of rather obscure practices going on across the piece in Sarkozy's political funding.
Beyond this trial, Paul, Sarkozy, I think, is representative of a French political class perceived as being above the law. Last year, of course, that appeals court ruled that he could serve time at home with an electronic bracelet instead of going to jail. Do you think that he or other public officials accused of wrongdoing here in France tend to benefit from special treatment?
I don't know if they benefit from special treatment. That's certainly the perception, that it's very difficult to do things on them. I mean, various other trials haven't succeeded. Obviously, the Bismuth case, as it's called, also known as the listening in trial that he was found guilty of last year. That that whole process it sticks. That's the problem. Even if not in the case that he was found guilty of back in December, but in other trials other accused that he's been charged with, the idea that they get away with these things, and we can think as well of François Fillon and the whole business of the fictitious jobs that he invented. It does seem to it feeds this sense that there is a corrupt political class. Having said that, the people who tend to use those arguments, the far right, are not exactly squeaky clean themselves.
We're going to move on now to our next story. On January 7th, Jean-Marie Le Pen passed away at 96 years old. Le Pen was, of course, the founder of the far-right National Front, now the National Rally, and credited with making the far-right an established force in French politics. But the death of a man who was openly racist, anti-Semitic, and boasted of torturing prisoners during the war against Algeria put much of France's political class in a rather awkward situation. Prime Minister François Bayrou described Le Pen as a fighter and a figure of French political life, with only representatives on the left, for the most part, openly refusing to mourn him. Meanwhile, a different situation played out in the streets, where hundreds of Parisians took to the streets to celebrate his death. Yinka Oyetade.
The announcement of a person's death isn't normally an opportunity to set off fireworks, throw confetti, or open bottles of Prosecco. But for the hundreds who gathered at Paris's Place de la République on Tuesday, the death of far-right politician Jean-Marie Le Pen was something to celebrate.
Yes, we are celebrating the death of someone who promoted racist and neo-Nazi ideas in France and around the world. So for once, yes, it's nice to know that this person will no longer be able to do harm.
Similar scenes of jubilation over Jean-Marie Le Pen's death were also on display in Marseille, where anti-fascist chants rang out.
Today we mark the death of a character we hated. We should celebrate when such hateful characters die.
No love lost for people here over the death of the founder of France's main far-right party, now known today as the National Rally. Earlier in the day, a somber mood could be felt in the party's stronghold of Hénin-Beaumont, where some still hold on to Jean-Marie Le Pen's extremist anti-immigration and nationalist ideas.
Politically, I think he was a bit ahead of his time. On certain issues, at the time he may have gone about it the wrong way. But as time passes, we are seeing that his ideas weren't bad.
For many in France, Jean-Marie Le Pen will be remembered as a polarizing and divisive figure who brought the far right into the mainstream.
Paul, I think it's less surprising to see the reaction we saw on the streets, but was it surprising to you to see mainstream politicians here in France on the center right, the center and the center left kind of struggle with how to talk about Le Pen after he died?
Yes, I was a bit. It's not as if they didn't know it was going to happen. I mean, he was an old man. They knew that he was not in good health. They should have been better prepared. A more robust response, I think, from the Prime Minister, particularly the Prime Minister Bayrou, who's not, his values. Okay, he's a Prime Minister of the centre right, but his values are not those of like Le Pen, or even of his daughter Marine Le Pen. So I was taken aback, personally, and as a commentator on French politics, that there wasn't a more robust. I mean, some of the right-wing politicians seem to be a bit more forthright in their position with regard to Le Pen. So I was a little bit surprised that certainly Bayrou wasn't a bit more robust in his response.
Paul, as a last question for you, how do you think that his death will affect the National Rally or even the far right in general here in France? Do you think it'll make him a martyr of sorts? Do you think it'll make his ideas disappear or really have no effect at all?
I think it will have very little effect, to be honest. I think that the far right, I mean, the thing about him is he bequeathed the far right a hardcore 10% of the vote. And his daughter has taken that on and has transformed that. Other far right-wing figures have appeared. People like Zemmour. We've moved beyond that. But one of the French people you interviewed there that you showed us was that idea of him being ahead of his time. We can disagree or we can agree or disagree about that, but he set the agenda, rightly or wrongly, and it's there. And now we've moved beyond that into other ideas. But there it is, that hardcore, making those ideas mainstream, getting them to become part of the political debate in France. That was his success. And we can deplore that or we can, laud that. But as commentators, we have to say that is what he did. But the far right is not going to disappear. Those ideas are there. The far right has changed in some of the ways that it expresses itself, but nevertheless, the real underlying hardcore, the kernel of its ideas that he bequeathed them, that is still there.
Paul Smith, thank you very much for coming on the show. That's unfortunately all we have time for today.
Thank you.
Well, that's all for this edition of Around the World. Thank you very much for joining us. Stay tuned. There's more news coming up shortly.